She had lived most of her life unnoticed, a shadow among people who never thought to look twice at her. To the world she was nothing more than a quiet young woman who kept her head down, who worked odd jobs to survive, and who never drew attention to herself. But inside her heart lived a fire that only one man had ever recognized, a fire that had been shaped, tested, and sharpened by hands that had once belonged to a legend. His name had been erased from history books, whispered only in secret conversations among old soldiers and hunters who still remembered what true mastery looked like, and though most thought he had disappeared forever, his greatest lesson still lived inside her. She had never told anyone about the years of training, the endless nights spent in forests and abandoned ranges, the scars on her hands from learning the weight of steel and the balance of a rifle, the bruises from failing again and again until he had forced her to rise stronger each time. He had told her once, with eyes like burning embers, "One day you'll take a shot that will change everything. And in that moment they won't see you anymore, they'll see me in you. And then the world will know who you really are." She had carried those words like a burden, never sure if she wanted that moment to come or if she feared it more than death itself. But life has a way of forcing moments upon those who least expect them, and hers came on a night drenched in fear and silence. The city she lived in was trembling under the grip of men who ruled with cruelty, who made ordinary lives bleed under the weight of power. No one dared to stand against them, for every voice that rose was quickly silenced, every face that dared to resist was never seen again. She had lived through years of this oppression, always hiding her strength, always folding herself into the shadows so that no one would ask questions about the calmness in her eyes or the way her hands moved with the precision of someone who had been taught by more than life. But that night she found herself cornered not by choice but by fate. A child had been taken hostage in the marketplace, used as bait to draw out rebels who might have been hiding among the crowd. The soldiers laughed as they held their rifles against the boy's head, mocking the silence of the people who stood frozen, too afraid to act. She had been there, just another face in the crowd, her hood pulled low, her eyes lowered as though fear had broken her. Inside, though, she felt the pulse of the training that had never left her, the rhythm of breath control, the sound of her old master's voice telling her that hesitation is what kills, that there are moments where one bullet is not just a bullet but the difference between hope and despair. She had told herself 100 times never to reveal what she had learned, never to show anyone what she was capable of, because once the mask came off there would be no way to put it back. But when she saw the boy's eyes, wide and wet with terror, she knew she had no choice. The crowd's silence was a cage and her heart pounded against its bars. Slowly she moved, slipping behind a wall as though stepping away in fear, and no one noticed when her hands reached beneath her coat and drew out the rifle she had not touched in years. Its weight was familiar, heavy yet balanced, the metal cold against her skin. She remembered the countless hours of training in the rain, the sound of her master's voice telling her that a true marksman carries not a weapon but a promise, that each shot is a story told in silence. Her fingers trembled for only a moment before they steadied, the years of practice guiding her without thought. She climbed the narrow steps of an abandoned building, heart pounding not with fear but with clarity. Every movement was quiet, controlled, her breathing matching the rhythm he had drilled into her. Inhale, hold, exhale, wait. From the rooftop she could see the marketplace, the boy's small body pressed against the chest of a soldier, the muzzle of the rifle against his head, the crowd trembling in terror below. Her vision tunneled, the noise of the world fading into silence. All that remained was the target, the line between life and death balanced on her trigger finger. She remembered her master's words, "Don't shoot to prove you can. Shoot because you must." For a moment she saw his face in her mind, his stern eyes watching her, waiting for her to decide. And then she let go of doubt. The shot rang out like thunder in the night, a single crack that shattered the silence of the marketplace. The soldier's body dropped instantly, the boy falling free, scrambling into the arms of the crowd. Gasps erupted as people turned to find where the shot had come from, fear and awe colliding in their eyes. Soldiers raised their rifles, shouting orders, but it was too late. The mark of the legend had already revealed itself. She ducked back, her heart slamming against her ribs, but her hands were steady. For the first time in years, she had allowed herself to become what she had been trained to be. And in that moment, those who had seen it knew. This was no ordinary shot, no blind stroke of luck. This was the shot of someone trained by a master whose name still haunted old memories. Whispers began to rise among the crowd even as chaos broke out. "It's him, no it can't be, but only he could have taught that." They didn't know her name, didn't know her face, but they knew what that shot meant. The legend was alive again through her hands. She fled the rooftop before the soldiers could corner her, weaving through alleys with the same precision she had been taught, her body moving with instincts honed by years of discipline. By the time she reached the safety of the shadows, the city was already buzzing with stories. Some said the old master had returned, others swore a ghost had taken vengeance, but none imagined it was her, the quiet girl no one ever noticed. She sat in the darkness, her rifle across her knees, her breath still even. Tears welled in her eyes, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing that she had finally stepped into the destiny her master had prepared her for. The world had seen her hand, and though they did not know her name, they knew the legend lived on. And she, hidden in the silence of the night, whispered to herself words she had once promised she would never forget. One shot, one truth. The morning after the shot, the city was no longer the same. Whispers traveled faster than bullets, through markets and taverns, across quiet homes where families huddled in fear of the soldier's boots. People spoke of the sound that had cut the night apart, of the soldier who had fallen dead before he could take the life of a child, of the precision so sharp that no ordinary rebel could have pulled it off. Rumors twisted into legends within hours, and at the heart of those rumors was a single truth. Whoever had taken that shot carried the spirit of a master who had once terrified governments and warlords alike. Soldiers combed the streets in fury, questioning, searching, dragging men and women into the open to demand answers. But no one knew. They only knew that for the first time in years, the oppressors looked unsettled, their arrogance shaken by a single invisible hand. She watched it all unfold from the shadows of the alleys, her hood pulled low, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she had begun something that could not be undone. She had not fired to ignite a rebellion, she had not fired to make herself a hero, she had fired because a child's life demanded it. Yet now the people's eyes shone differently, filled with hope that had long been buried. And hope was dangerous. She remembered nights by the fire with her master, the way his voice carried like steel wrapped in smoke as he spoke of power. "It's not the weapon they fear," he told her once, cleaning his rifle with slow deliberate motions. "It's the idea that someone can still stand against them. A bullet is just metal. But a shot placed at the right time, that's a spark. Sparks spread and sparks burn." At the time she had not understood the full weight of those words. She only knew that he carried scars no one else could see, and that sometimes in the quietest hours, he stared into the darkness as though haunted by the things he had done to keep the weak alive. He had told her he wanted her to live a different life, one that did not bury her in battles and endless violence. But he had also told her that fate has a cruel way of bringing choices you cannot run from. Now, as she watched soldiers tighten their grip on the city and people whisper her master's name in fear and reverence, she realized that fate had come knocking at her door, and by pulling the trigger she had opened it. The soldiers became merciless in their hunt. Posters went up overnight with vague sketches of a phantom sniper, promises of rewards for information, threats of punishment for silence. Entire blocks were searched, homes broken into, and yet no trace of her could be found. She stayed hidden, moving only when the dark gave her cover, eating little, sleeping even less, always carrying the rifle close as though it were the last piece of her master she had left. Each time she closed her eyes, she heard the echo of the shot, not with regret but with the heavy reminder that it had set a chain into motion. People began to leave flowers at the spot where the child had been saved, quiet offerings of gratitude to a ghost they did not know. She avoided those places, afraid of being seen, afraid of the strange fire stirring in her own chest. She had lived her whole life as a shadow, and now she was the spark her master had once spoken of. The contradiction tore at her heart. She did not want glory, she did not want fame, she only wanted to live in peace. But peace had been stolen from the city long before she ever picked up a rifle, and perhaps it had been foolish to think she could escape the path carved into her by a legend's hands. One evening, as the city boiled under curfews and patrols, she found herself in the ruined church at the edge of town, a place long abandoned by priests and prayers. She sat in the silence, her rifle across her lap, staring at the broken stained glass that glowed faintly with the dying light of the setting sun. Memories of her master flooded her. His gruff voice, his unrelenting discipline, the rare moments when he allowed a faint smile to break through the stone of his face. He had been more than a teacher. He had been a father she never had, a guardian who had seen her not as the weak child the world thought she was but as someone who could carry the weight of survival. She whispered his name into the empty air, the sound trembling in her throat. "You told me it would come. You told me one day they would see you in me. But I don't want to be you. I don't want to be a ghost people fear." The silence gave her no answer, only the hollow echo of her own words. Yet in that silence she felt something stir inside, the faintest echo of his presence, as if the man who had shaped her still walked beside her, unseen but never gone. Days turned into weeks and the legend grew. Stories spread beyond the city, into villages and faraway settlements where people had long lost faith that the oppressors could ever be challenged. Each story was twisted into something larger, some saying she could shoot a coin from a mile away, others claiming she could see through walls, still others whispering that she was the ghost of the master himself returned to finish what he had started. With every story the soldiers' fear deepened, their desperation sharpened, and their violence grew more brutal. Yet the people held on to the hope that somewhere in the shadows, their savior still watched over them. She could not bring herself to destroy that hope, even if it was built on a lie they would never truly know. And so she remained hidden, torn between the life she wanted and the destiny her master had foretold. One night, as she slipped through the narrow alleys with her hood pulled low, she heard footsteps trailing her, light but deliberate. Instinct flared, the old training sparking to life as her hand tightened on the rifle concealed beneath her coat. She spun into a shadowed corner, waiting, breathing steady as her master had taught her. The footsteps drew closer until a figure emerged, not a soldier but a boy, the same child she had saved that night in the marketplace. His eyes were wide not with fear but with something else, recognition. He held a small flower in his trembling hand, and when he saw her, his lips parted in a whisper. "It was you." She froze, every instinct screaming to deny it, to turn away, to vanish back into the shadows. But the boy stepped closer, his gaze steady. "They're afraid because they know you're real. You gave us hope." He placed the flower on the ground before her, then ran off into the night before she could speak. She stood there, staring at the fragile bloom, her heart heavy with an ache she could not name. For the first time since that night, she wondered if perhaps her master had been right, not about becoming a ghost but about the power of a single spark. She picked up the flower, its petals soft against her calloused fingers, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel something she had long buried, the possibility that she was meant not just to survive, but to lead others out of the darkness. She slipped back into the night, the flower tucked into her coat, her steps quieter than whispers, but in her heart, the silence was no longer empty. It carried the weight of a legend, and the fragile breath of hope that would not die. The days that followed were marked by tension so thick that the city itself seemed to hold its breath. Patrols doubled, checkpoints sprang up at every corner, and men in uniforms marched with nervous aggression, their eyes darting constantly toward rooftops and alleys as if expecting another invisible shot to cut one of them down at any moment. Fear had shifted. For the first time it no longer belonged to the people alone. The oppressors carried it too, and though they disguised it behind barked orders and swinging rifles, she could see it in their movements, in the way their hands twitched near triggers, in the way they flinched at sudden sounds. She moved through the shadows unseen, hood pulled low, and watched this change with a mixture of satisfaction and dread. She had never meant to become a symbol, but a symbol she had become. And symbols, she knew from her master's lessons, carried both hope and danger in equal measure. Hope gave strength to the weak, but danger painted a target on the one who bore it. She could feel the weight of that target pressing on her every step. Her master had always told her that the world would test her not when she was weakest but when she was strongest, because strength drew challenges like fire drew moths. "When they believe you are more than flesh," he had said, his voice steady as he tightened her grip on the rifle in the rain, "they will come for you with everything they have because fear makes men desperate." Those words returned to her as she moved through the crumbling ruins at the edge of the city, listening to the distant sounds of soldiers interrogating shopkeepers and tearing through homes. She could almost hear his voice beside her, reminding her that legends were not born of comfort but of sacrifice, that once the world had seen her hand, she would never again know the silence of anonymity. She had wanted to live quietly, unseen, to bury her training deep where no one could ever call upon it. But the shot had woken the city, and now there was no going back. She had opened the door her master had warned her about, and every step she took carried her further inside. She tried to stay hidden, to move without leaving a trace, but the city was not kind to ghosts who walked among the living. Faces turned toward her as she passed, whispers followed in her wake, and though no one dared to call out, she felt the weight of recognition pressing against her skin. The boy she had saved had spoken to others. She could see it in their eyes, the faint glimmer of hope they carried now, fragile but unbroken. They did not know her name, but they knew her presence, and that was enough to draw both reverence and danger. She found herself torn between two worlds, the life of silence she had clung to for years, and the life of a shadow legend that others demanded of her. The conflict gnawed at her every moment, keeping her awake through long nights as she sat in abandoned buildings, cleaning her rifle, staring into the emptiness where her master's voice used to be. One night, she heard gunfire in the distance, sharp and chaotic, followed by screams that carried through the still air. Against her better judgment, she moved toward it, instincts guiding her feet through the labyrinth of alleys until she reached the outskirts of the marketplace. Soldiers had cornered a group of men and women accused of sheltering rebels, their rifles raised, their shouts filling the night. The people cowered against a wall, their faces pale with terror, children clutching their parents as the soldiers prepared to execute them as a warning. She froze in the shadows, every nerve screaming at her to stay hidden, to avoid drawing more attention. But her hands trembled on the rifle she carried, her master's voice ringing in her ears. If you turn away from injustice when you can stop it, then all your training means nothing. A shot that saves is worth 10 that destroy. Her breath steadied, her heart slowed, and once again, the world narrowed to the line between her and her target. She climbed onto a broken balcony, positioning herself with the care of someone who had been molded for this exact moment. The chaos below blurred into silence, every detail sharpening. The gleam of rifles in the torchlight, the fear etched on the faces of the accused, the cruel smirk on the commander's lips as he raised his arm to give the order. She squeezed the trigger and the crack of the shot tore the night apart. The commander's body jerked and crumpled before he could speak, his men scattering in confusion, shouting wildly as they fired into the darkness. Panic spread through their ranks as the people seized the chance to flee, vanishing into the safety of the alleys. She did not linger to see the aftermath. She melted back into the shadows, her steps silent, her breath calm. Yet she knew the whispers would grow louder now, that every act would build the legend higher until it towered over her own identity. As dawn broke, the city was alive with stories. Some claimed the ghost had struck again, others swore it was the hand of justice itself, while a few whispered the forbidden name of her master, daring to believe he had returned through her. Soldiers grew more ruthless in their hunt, but their cruelty only deepened the people's belief that the legend was real and watching over them. She sat in silence within the hollow walls of an abandoned warehouse, her rifle across her knees, her body weary but her spirit restless. She thought of the flower the boy had left her, still pressed carefully between the folds of her coat, and wondered what her master would say if he saw her now. Would he scold her for stepping into the fire, or would he nod in silent approval, knowing she had embraced the role he had warned her about? Her answer came not in words but in a memory that rose unbidden. She saw him standing tall against a storm, his coat whipping in the wind, his voice steady as he told her, "A shot is not just death. It is truth. And truth has a price." She closed her eyes and for the first time she accepted that the price was her anonymity, her quiet life, the dream of peace she had clung to for so long. She was no longer just the girl who passed unseen in the crowd. She was the echo of a man whose legend still haunted the world, the hand that carried his teachings into a new generation. And whether she wanted it or not, the city had claimed her as its hidden protector. That night, as she prepared to move once more before the soldiers drew too close, she looked out across the rooftops and whispered to the empty air, "You were right. They see you in me. But this time they will know it's not just your shadow. It's me." The wind carried her words into the darkness, and for the first time she felt not only the weight of the legend she bore but the faintest spark of her own rising from within it. The night grew colder as she slipped through the veins of the city, moving from shadow to shadow like a phantom. Every corner held danger now, every rooftop a potential trap, yet she moved with the precision her master had carved into her bones. The soldiers were no longer simply patrolling, they were hunting, and not just with guns but with eyes sharpened by fear. They had begun to bring in trackers, mercenaries from other cities, men whose reputations dripped with violence and whose loyalty could be bought with blood money. She overheard their whispers in taverns, names spoken with both dread and reverence, hunters who specialized in finding the unfindable. For the first time since she had pulled the trigger that night in the marketplace, she felt a tremor of unease in her chest. It was no longer only the faceless machine of the regime she faced but individuals who lived for the chase, predators drawn to the scent of her shot. Yet fear did not freeze her. It honed her, sharpened her instincts the way storms had sharpened her training long ago. She carried the rifle not as a weapon but as an extension of her spirit, a bond between past and present, between her and the man who had shaped her into what she now was. The people meanwhile began to look at her shadow as though it were a blessing. Murmurs spread through markets, women whispered to their children that the ghost of justice was watching, and men carried secret hope in their eyes where once there had been only defeat. She saw it in the way they walked a little taller despite the soldiers' cruelty, in the way they left small offerings of food or cloth at hidden corners as though praying to an unseen protector. She avoided those gifts, slipping away before anyone could see her, But each time she saw them her chest tightened with something she could not name, an ache, perhaps, or the beginnings of belonging. Yet she knew that hope was a double-edged blade. The more they believed in her, the more desperate her enemies would become to unmask and destroy her. Already she had caught glimpses of unfamiliar faces in the alleys, hard men with cold eyes, moving with the deliberate grace of hunters. She recognized the signs, for her master had taught her how to read predators. The most dangerous enemy, he had said, is the one who hunts you not because he must, but because he craves the test. He will see you not as prey but as proof of his own legend. It did not take long for that warning to come true. One night as she crossed the rooftops near the river, she felt it, the sharp prickle at the back of her neck, the unmistakable sense of being watched. She crouched low, rifle tight against her body and scanned the shadows. At first there was nothing but the whisper of wind, the glimmer of moonlight on the water. Then she saw it, a flicker of movement, too steady, too patient, someone matching her steps from a distance. Her breath slowed, her heartbeat settling into the rhythm of focus. She moved carefully, testing her stalker, doubling back through narrow paths, shifting her pace. But each time the shadow followed. Whoever it was, they knew how to track without being seen. By dawn she had slipped away into the maze of abandoned factories, her body tense, her mind racing with the knowledge that the hunt had truly begun. She thought of her master's warnings about hunters, of how they lived for the moment when prey revealed its desperation. She would not give them that satisfaction. If they wanted her, they would have to see not a frightened girl but the mark of the man who had shaped her. Yet even as her resolve hardened, she felt the crushing weight of loneliness pressing against her. She had no allies, no one to trust, no one to share the burden of what she carried. In the silence of those empty ruins, she found herself whispering to the ghost of her master, telling him the things she had never spoken aloud. You said one day the world would see you and me. But what then? Do I become nothing but your echo? Do I lose myself until there's nothing left but the shadow of your name? The questions echoed off the hollow walls, unanswered. But in the stillness she imagined his stern face, the way his eyes softened only when she doubted herself. She tightened her grip on the rifle and told herself that she would not vanish into his shadow completely. She would become something new, something more. The chance to prove it came sooner than she expected. Weeks later, the city square became a stage of terror as soldiers dragged rebels into the open, forcing the crowd to watch their punishment. She stood hidden on the rooftops, eyes scanning the scene, and there among the soldiers was a new figure. A tall man dressed not in uniform but in black, his movements deliberate, his gaze cold as he surveyed the crowd. She recognized him instantly, though she had never met him before. He was one of the hunters, one of the predators brought to find her. His reputation preceded him, whispered in the alleys like a curse. Cale, the tracker who never failed. He carried no rifle, only a sidearm and a blade at his hip, but it was the way he moved, the way his head tilted as though listening to sounds no one else could hear, that told her he was dangerous. He looked at the rooftops, scanning them one by one, and for the briefest moment, his gaze lingered near where she crouched. A chill ran down her spine. When the soldiers raised their rifles to fire upon the kneeling rebels, she felt the same pull that had driven her before, the refusal to watch innocence die when she had the power to stop it. Her hands moved on instinct, setting her rifle, her breath falling into rhythm. One shot cracked the air, and the soldier with the execution order dropped instantly. Chaos erupted, the rebels breaking free, the crowd screaming, soldiers scattering in confusion. But Cale did not move with them. He stood still, his eyes narrowing, his head turning slowly until he fixed his gaze on the exact rooftop she had fired from. She pulled back, retreating into the maze of shadows, but she knew with a cold certainty that he had seen enough. The game had changed. It was no longer soldiers against a ghost. It was a hunter against his prey. That night, as she fled through the narrow alleys, every sound seemed sharper, every shadow heavier. She could feel him on her trail, not close enough to strike but close enough to remind her that she was never alone now. The legend of her master had painted a target on her back, and Cale would not stop until he had torn the mask away. Yet instead of fear, she felt a strange calm settle within her. Her master had always told her that true strength is revealed not in comfort but when you are forced to face an enemy who mirrors your own skill. She had inherited the training of a legend, but now she would have to prove it was not just his shadow that kept her alive. She whispered into the night as she moved, her voice steady despite the danger. You think I'm prey? You'll see soon enough. I'm not just his echo. I'm me. And in that vow, she felt the first spark of her own legend beginning to burn. The next morning dawned with a quiet heaviness that seemed to hang in the air, as though the entire town sensed something was about to shift and no one could quite name what it was. And Alara rose before the sun fully broke the horizon, her body moving with the memory of discipline drilled into her by years of training under the legend whose name she still could not bring herself to speak aloud. She washed her face in the basin by the window, tied back her hair, and strapped the rifle to her back, the same weapon she had been taught to handle with both precision and respect. And as she moved quietly down the narrow wooden stairs of the inn where she had been staying, she felt the familiar tug in her chest that told her the world was about to demand something more from her, something she could not turn away from even if she tried. And outside the air was brisk, carrying the scents of earth and smoke, reminding her of early mornings in the training fields when her teacher would have her fire at targets again and again until her hands stopped trembling and her breath aligned with the rhythm of her heart. And though she had left that life behind, it had never really left her. In the square of the small town, people gathered slowly, first the curious, then the worried, and then the fearful, as word spread that raiders had been sighted at the edge of the valley, moving with a boldness that spoke not of hunger but of intent. And Alara stood among them unnoticed at first, just another figure cloaked in a plain jacket, her eyes scanning the horizon with the calmness of someone who had seen this kind of danger before, though the others shifted nervously, their hands clutching tools instead of weapons, their voices low and uncertain. And she remembered her mentor's words, that real courage was not loud or boastful, but quiet and steady in the moment when everything else faltered. And so she waited, listening, breathing, letting the morning unfold. A rider came into view, galloping hard, mud spraying from the hooves of the horse, and when he pulled up in the square, his face was pale beneath a mask of sweat, and he shouted that the raiders were only an hour away, perhaps less, and panic rippled through the gathered crowd, some people running to gather their children, others arguing loudly about whether to flee into the hills or barricade themselves inside their homes. And amid the rising clamor, Alara felt the weight of decision pressing down on her, because though she had sworn never to reveal the depth of her training, never to let anyone know whose student she had been, she also knew that if she stood by in silence, these people would have no chance, and that knowledge burned hotter in her than the fear of exposure. She moved to the edge of the square, her voice low at first as she spoke to a few, telling them how to gather supplies, how to move with order rather than chaos, and they looked at her uncertainly, as though she were no different than the rest of them, until she asked for the rifle she carried, unstrapped it, and with a fluidity that seemed almost unreal in its grace, she checked the weapon, loaded it, and lifted her eyes to the far ridge where a crow had perched, black against the pale sky. And in one smooth motion she raised the rifle, steadied her breathing and fired, the shot ringing across the valley, echoing back from the hills, and when the bird fell in silence, the crowd around her went still, staring at her not as a stranger now but as someone carrying something they could not name, and in their silence she saw the moment the truth began to leak out, not in words, but in the stunned expressions that said they recognized the mark of training far beyond anything ordinary. Whispers spread quickly. Who had taught her? How could she shoot like that? Was she perhaps a soldier once, or the child of some forgotten warrior? But none dared ask directly, and Alara, feeling the heat of their eyes on her, simply lowered the rifle and told them calmly that if they wanted to live, they needed to follow her instructions without question. And perhaps it was the certainty in her tone, or the memory of the crow falling from the sky with a single shot, but they obeyed, moving with a sudden order that had been missing moments before, and she began to guide them, sending the children and the old toward the caves north of the village, setting the strongest men to build barricades from carts and timber, and placing others on rooftops with whatever weapons they could find. And though none of them could match her skill, she knew from her training that even poorly armed defenders could turn the tide with the right placement and discipline. And as she worked, she felt again the ghostly presence of her mentor, the legend who had given her everything, standing at her shoulder, reminding her that skill was not meant to be hidden when it could save lives. The minutes slipped by quickly, the horizon darkening with the approach of riders who came in a loose formation, their banners torn and their laughter carried cruelly on the wind, and Alara positioned herself at the highest point in the square, her rifle resting lightly against her shoulder, her eyes narrowing as she studied the way they moved, noting their speed, the gaps in their lines, the arrogance that came from years of unchecked terrorizing, and she whispered softly to herself, a habit she had picked up in training, repeating the mantra that skill and patience could shape the outcome long before the first arrow or bullet flew. And below her, the townspeople held their breath, waiting for her signal, their faith now tied to this young woman who had revealed only a sliver of what she was capable of. And in that moment, Alara realized there was no turning back, that the single shot which had given her away had also bound her to them, making her not just a wanderer with a hidden past, but the only shield they had against the storm that was about to break. The raiders drew closer, their shouts growing louder as the sound of hooves shook the ground, and Alara stood firm at the front of the square, her rifle pressed against her shoulder, her eyes narrowed with the kind of calm intensity that had been drilled into her over years of merciless training, the kind that did not waver when fear rose, and as the townspeople braced behind the barricades they had built from wagons and timber, she felt their uncertainty pressing against her like a storm, but she also felt the quiet weight of responsibility settle deeper in her chest, because she knew the moment she pulled the trigger again there would be no returning to anonymity, her skill would blaze out for everyone to see, and yet she could not let hesitation win when lives hung in the balance, so she inhaled slowly, exhaled just as evenly, and when the lead rider raised his blade to signal the charge, she squeezed the trigger, the rifle cracking across the valley as the man toppled from his saddle, his cry cut short, and the raiders faltered in their momentum for just a heartbeat, shocked by the precision of the shot, and in that heartbeat Alara shouted for the villagers to hold strong, her voice carrying above the din, steady and commanding in a way that left no room for doubt, and the villagers, hearing the authority in her tone, gripped their makeshift weapons tighter, no longer trembling as before, but holding themselves like people who had been given a chance. The raiders roared in anger, spurred forward by vengeance, and the clash erupted as arrows flew and gunshots cracked, the air filling with dust and screams, but Alara moved through it with fluidity, reloading with a rhythm that had been etched into her bones, firing, ducking, shifting, her body one with the weapon, and each time she pulled the trigger another rider fell, another enemy was slowed, and the villagers, inspired by her, fought harder than they thought themselves capable of, swinging axes, thrusting spears, and even hurling stones with desperate accuracy, and though they were outnumbered and untrained, Alara's presence wove them together into something resembling a defense, something strong enough to make the raiders curse and falter as they tried to push through. Dust stung her eyes, smoke from burning torches curled through the air, and the acrid taste of gunpowder coated her tongue, but she kept going, her body moving almost instinctively, guided by the endless drills of her training, every lesson whispered into her memory by the voice of the legend who had shaped her, reminding her to conserve energy, to make every shot count, to trust her instincts even when chaos threatened to tear the ground from beneath her feet, and as she fought, she realized the strange irony of it all, that the very past she had tried to keep hidden was the only reason these people would survive this day, that the legacy of her mentor lived on in her actions even though she had never intended to carry it forward. A sudden cry pulled her attention, and she saw a young boy trapped against the wall of a burning house, a raider bearing down on him with a cruel smile, and without thinking, Alara pivoted, sighted, and fired, the shot tearing through the raider before he could swing his blade, and the boy scrambled free, his wide terrified eyes locking on her for a brief moment before he ran, and in that fleeting glance she saw not just fear but something else, trust, belief, the beginnings of awe, and she felt a pang deep in her chest, for she had not asked to be seen as anything more than a wanderer, but now she was becoming something larger in their eyes, something tied to the legend they whispered about without daring to speak the name. The battle raged on, the minutes stretching into an eternity of blood and fire, but slowly, inch by inch, the tide began to turn, the raiders realizing that their easy conquest had become a costly fight, their numbers thinning under the steady rain of Alara's bullets and the stubborn resistance of villagers who refused to break, and at last, with curses and furious shouts, the remnants of the raiders began to retreat, pulling back across the valley, leaving behind their dead and wounded, and as the echoes of their retreat faded into the hills, silence fell heavy across the town, broken only by the crackle of fires and the sobs of those who realized they were still alive, and Alara lowered her rifle, her arms trembling now with exhaustion, the adrenaline ebbing from her veins, leaving her hollow but standing, and when she turned she found dozens of eyes fixed on her, not with suspicion anymore, but with reverence, gratitude, and something close to fear. No one spoke at first, the silence thick with unspoken questions, and then an old man stepped forward, his hands rough and calloused, his eyes wet, and he asked her softly, almost reverently, where she had learned to shoot like that, who had taught her, and Alara froze, her heart pounding because she knew the truth balanced on the edge of her lips, the truth that she had sworn never to reveal, but in that moment the memory of her mentor filled her mind, the patient hands guiding hers, the calm voice teaching her to steady her breath, the fierce pride in his eyes when she struck her first distant target, and she felt tears sting her eyes, not from weakness but from the ache of carrying a secret too long, and though she did not speak his name, though she could not, she let her silence be answer enough, for they understood, all of them, that no ordinary soldier could have shaped her into what she was, only a legend could have done that, and now they knew it from the way she moved, from the way she had saved them with a single shot that had given everything away, night descended over the battered town, and the silence that followed the chaos of battle was almost heavier than the clash itself. The fires had been put out, the wounded tended to as best as the villagers could manage, and the dead laid in quiet rows along the edge of the square, but through it all Ilara remained awake, her body weary yet restless, her hands still trembling faintly from the recoil of the rifle that had not left her side all day, and she sat at the top of the hill that overlooked the valley, staring into the distance where the raiders had vanished hours before, knowing deep down that their retreat had not been a true defeat, only a pause, because men like that did not forget humiliation, and they would come again angrier and stronger, and though the villagers whispered prayers of thanks and called her savior behind her back, Ilara felt no triumph, only the pressing weight of what she had revealed, because with every glance she caught, every whisper that reached her ears, it was clearer that they had begun to suspect the truth, that she carried not just skill but a legacy, the mark of someone shaped by hands far greater than her own, and while she had once believed she could hide forever, the single shot that brought down the crow, the precision that felled the raider leader, all of it had already betrayed her, and now there was no veil thick enough to disguise who she had been trained by, even if she never spoke the name aloud. As the moonlight spilled silver across the fields, Ilara's mind drifted back unbidden to the nights of her youth, when her mentor would keep her awake long past exhaustion, forcing her to fire again and again under the cover of darkness until her body learned to obey without hesitation, until her mind learned to find stillness in the chaos of shadows, and she remembered the roughness of his voice, the way he spoke of patience as a weapon sharper than any blade, of focus as the true edge of every shot, and though she had resented him at times for pushing her beyond her limits, she now knew it was that same relentless forging that had made her what she was tonight, the only barrier between the raiders and this fragile town, the only living thread of the legend he had been, and as the memory pressed against her heart she felt tears threaten, for she had never truly grieved him, never allowed herself to, carrying his absence like a wound she had disguised beneath strength, and now that wound pulsed fresh because by firing those shots she had resurrected him in the eyes of these people, whether she wanted to or not. Below her, lanterns flickered as the villagers tried to rest, though she doubted any would sleep easily, and she thought of the boy she had saved earlier, his wide eyes brimming with fear and awe, and she realized what it meant for someone so young to witness her skill, what it meant for stories to take root in his mind, because children did not keep secrets, they carried tales like fire across dry grass, and by tomorrow her name, or at least the memory of her presence, would begin to spread, reaching ears beyond the valley, perhaps even stirring old enemies who had once hunted her mentor, and though she longed for quiet anonymity, she knew that once a legend's shadow fell across you, there was no outrunning it, only stepping into it fully or being consumed. She tightened her grip on the rifle, its wood worn smooth where her hands had shaped it through years of use, and whispered softly into the night that she had not asked for this burden, not asked to inherit a legacy that drew danger like blood drew wolves, but she also knew she could not undo it, not after the boy's life saved, not after the villagers had seen her transform fear into defiance, and so she resolved quietly, silently, that if the raiders returned, if the whispers grew, she would face it as her mentor had taught her, not with pride or boasting but with unyielding precision, because skill was not about glory, it was about survival, and survival was the only tribute she could offer to the one who had raised her from a trembling child into the woman she was now. The wind rustled through the valley grass, carrying with it faint echoes that reminded her too much of battle cries, and she felt the heaviness of fatigue press harder against her bones, but she did not move from her post, unwilling to let her guard drop, for she knew better than most that enemies often struck hardest when they seemed broken, and as her eyes scanned the horizon, sharp and steady despite the ache behind them, she realized that whether she wanted it or not, tonight she had become a story in the making, one that would outlive her in whispers and rumors, and perhaps that was the truest mark of her mentor's teaching, that legends were never meant to rest quietly, they burned their way into the world through those they touched, and she, against her own wishes, had become the ember left smoldering in his wake. Dawn broke slowly over the valley, the sky painted in pale strokes of gold and gray, and Ilara had not closed her eyes even once through the long hours of the night. Her body exhausted yet her spirit unwilling to surrender to rest, for she knew that the raiders would not let their humiliation stand, they would return as surely as the sun did, and as the first rays of light cut across the field she caught the movement of figures on the horizon, distant but unmistakable, a larger force than before, their banners torn yet raised high, and her breath caught as she realized the truth of what she had feared, that the single battle of yesterday had only been the beginning, that her one shot had not just revealed her skill to the villagers but had also lit a fire that would draw enemies from far beyond the valley, and she stood slowly, her rifle slung against her back, her muscles aching but her resolve harder than iron, for she could not turn away now, not when so many faces looked to her with hope they dared not speak aloud, and as the villagers stirred awake, their eyes found her, and though none spoke, she saw in their gazes that they already knew, they would follow her again whether to survival or to death. She descended into the square, her steps steady despite the heaviness in her bones, and she began giving orders without hesitation, telling the strongest to fortify the barricades, sending the younger ones to carry water and supplies, placing lookouts on the rooftops with bows and old muskets, and though fear still shimmered in their eyes, they obeyed without question, because the memory of her precision lingered, the sound of her rifle a ghost in their minds that reminded them she was no ordinary woman, and as she moved among them, she thought of her mentor again, of the countless times he had told her that leadership was not about command but about trust, and she understood it now in a way she never had before, for she could feel their trust pressing against her like a living thing, fragile and desperate yet unshakable, and she swore silently that she would not betray it, no matter the cost. The raiders drew nearer with every passing minute, their numbers at least double what they had faced the day before, and Alara climbed to her vantage point once more, the rifle heavy but familiar in her hands, and as she stared down at the approaching force she felt no fear, only a quiet clarity that seemed to wash through her veins, for she had lived her life trying to outrun her mentor's shadow, but now she saw it differently, not as a burden but as a shield, as proof that she carried within her the strength to stand when others could not, and when the first wave of raiders charged she inhaled slowly, exhaled with control, and squeezed the trigger, the crack of the rifle splitting the morning air, dropping a rider instantly, and with that single shot the battle was joined once more, a storm of violence and courage tearing through the valley. Hours seemed to stretch and fold into themselves, the clash unending, the cries of men and women blending with the pounding of hooves and the crash of makeshift barricades, but Alara fought with the same relentless precision as before, her shots never wasted, each one striking true, each one carving away at the tide that threatened to drown them, and though her arms shook and her chest burned with exhaustion, she did not falter, not when she saw the villagers holding the line beside her, not when she saw the boy she had saved carrying water to the wounded, his face streaked with dirt but shining with courage, and in that moment she understood what her mentor had meant when he said that a single spark could set an entire world alight, because her choice to reveal herself, to fire that first shot, had sparked something in these people that could not be extinguished, not even by fear. The battle raged until the sun climbed high overhead, until the raiders finally broke once more, retreating with curses and shouts, leaving behind their dead and their fury, and the villagers erupted in cries of relief, some collapsing to the ground in tears, others clutching one another tightly, and Alara stood in the center of it all, her rifle lowered, her body trembling with exhaustion, her mind strangely quiet, and she realized that though she had not sought glory, though she had not asked to be seen, she had become something she could not deny, not just a fighter, not just a survivor, but a symbol of hope, and in their eyes she could see the beginnings of a story that would spread beyond this valley, a story of a woman trained by a legend whose name was whispered in awe, a story that would not belong to her alone but to all who had witnessed it. She felt tears burn her eyes as she tilted her head back to the sky, whispering softly to the memory of her mentor that she had not failed him, that his teachings had lived on through her even when she tried to bury them, and though the pain of his loss still ached within her, she felt for the first time that it was no longer a wound but a bond, an unbreakable thread that tied her to him across time and silence, and in that bond she found peace. As the villagers gathered around her, offering thanks she could not put into words, she simply nodded, her silence speaking louder than anything she could say, and in the hush that followed she knew with absolute certainty that though she would leave this town someday, though her path would carry her into dangers yet unseen, the legend she carried would never again be hidden, for one shot had already given it away, and from that moment forward, she would no longer deny who she was or the truth of who had trained her, because the world had seen, and once the world sees, it never forgets. The end.